and welcome to this episode of Military History Inside Out. Today I speak with Associate Professor Mehmet Gurses about his latest book on the Kurdish conflict, which has been going on since 1984 within Turkey. So thank you and enjoy. I'm speaking with Associate Professor Mehmet Gurses, author of Anatomy of a Civil War, Socio-Political Impacts of the Kurdish Conflict in Turkey. Thank you for speaking with me.
Thank you for having me, Cris.
So first, can you tell me, how did you get into studying and writing on this subject? And you can go as far back as you'd like.
Well, obviously, like all other books, this book also started with a story. Now, I was born and raised in the southeastern region of Turkey, which is a predominantly Kurdish part of Turkey.
Mm-hmm.
I am an ethnic Kurd from Turkey, and I did not even speak Turkish, the official language, up until I was 7 years old, like many other Kurdish children, I should say. So after elementary and middle school, I received a scholarship to study in Izmir, one of the largest cities located in the western part of the country.
Mm-hmm.
And then I moved to Istanbul, the largest city in the country, for my college years. And after that, I decided to get my PhD in the United States, and I moved to the United States about 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Now, after I moved to the United States, I ended up doing my PhD in political science at the University of North Texas.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the first classes that I took was by Professor David Mason, and the class was about civil wars, about armed conflict, about political violence.
Mm-hmm.
That was, and I remember telling Professor Mason, who later became my dissertation advisor, and we ended up co-authoring several academic works and articles. I remember telling him that the things that he's teaching me in that class actually is helping me to make sense of my own experiences, that he's actually helping me to understand my own experiences as a person.
Mm-hmm.
So my relationship to studying armed conflict, civil war, as much as it goes back to my childhood, because unfortunately I was born into a civil war. I was born into an armed conflict, and after I was trained as a social scientist, as a political scientist, trying to make sense of those experiences from political science perspective, I tried to come up with a social scientific way of telling this story. So in a way, it took me, I would say, well, from 2002 to 2018, it took me about 16 years of training and writing and thinking, and learning about other similar cases. Let's say the war in El Salvador in the 1990s, in Nicaragua, in many other countries in Africa and Asia. And eventually, after years of doing this in the United States, I visited my hometown, and it was about 10 years gap. I hadn't been to my hometown. I hadn't seen it for about 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized how much change that has happened. I remember asking about a couple of my elementary school friends, whom I went to school with for 5 years as a schoolboy. And I was told that two of them actually joined the rebellion in the 1990s,
mm-hmm.
which I did not know about. I had no clue about what they were doing. I had lost touch with them. And later on, I learned about one of them was killed, and the other one had become a refugee in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
So when I looked at this radical I was fortunate enough to leave the region to get a scholarship to study in the western part of the country. And later on, I ended up in the United States doing my PhD, now working as a professor at an American institution, whereas the other one was killed in his 20s, and the third person had become a refugee. So I decided to, in a way, tell the story about what happens to people when they go through an armed conflict. Mm-hmm. And my primary concern was not necessarily telling the story from the perspective of someone who joined an armed group, mm-hmm. but I wanted to actually tell the story to what happens to ordinary civilians, mm-hmm. which I consider myself as an ordinary civilian, because millions of people went through this since 1984, that is the year when the Kurdish insurgent group began its armed conflict with the Turkish state. Mm-hmm. And it has been more than 30 years of on and off conflict. Mm-hmm. And this is essentially the story of these 30 years of war, destruction, conflict, and then trying to give a comprehensive examination of this by telling the other side of the story, that war is more than just destruction. War can be transformative. War can sometimes actually produce some positive outcomes. That's essentially the story behind the book.
Mm-hmm. So how do you, considering all the different things you can discuss, how do you divide up the book? How is it laid out?
Now, when you look at the literature on war and change, that was my reference point. And obviously I ended up reading and studying similar cases in Uganda, in Sierra Leone, in El Salvador. I also got into the literature on trauma and war, such as what happens to someone who goes through this. Oftentimes, you would see the negative outcomes of going through such an experience, because war is a horrible thing. War is destructive. There are several studies, fairly recent, who are trying to shed light on the other side of the war, that building on the cases of Uganda, Sierra Leone, El Salvador, and several other particular cases, trying to tell a story of how war also can result in empowering people who actually experience it. So when I try to design this project, the first chapter, the introduction chapter, I introduced my concept of socio-political change. Mm-hmm. And the brief introduction of the Kurdish insurgency in Turkey, and why the Kurdish insurgency in Turkey actually deserves to be studied like this. Mm-hmm. But before I get to my theory section, in which I try to explain why under some circumstances this destructive phenomena can actually produce some positive outcomes at the same time, I also have a separate chapter on what I call it, the dark side of the war. Mm-hmm. In it, I look at the destructive nature of the war in the Kurdish case. And the Kurdish case is not really different than many other cases. There is trauma, there is destruction, there is dislocation and disorientation. It is there. It's something that I think we have to make a note of. But later on, I had an issue with reducing a powerful event such as war, especially an event that has been going on for more than 30 years. Reducing it to just another trauma, I wasn't really satisfied with that explanation. Mm-hmm. And in the theory section, when I tried to give an overview of an integrated theory on how war can actually lead to some positive outcomes, I tried to articulate that civil war is a political phenomenon, and it should not be reduced just to another major life crisis. Mm-hmm. Because when you look at the literature on this, oftentimes they build on this psychological studies, post-traumatic stress disorder versus post-traumatic stress growth. But my issue was that your experiences as an individual who goes through civil war should be qualitatively different than the experiences of someone who is struggling and fighting, for instance, cancer, mm-hmm. Or going through a divorce or another major life crisis. Because the civil war is essentially a political phenomenon. And then the suffering and the pain that the war causes needs to be contextualized, mm-hmm. needs to be understood in the context of the war. That is the theory section of my chapter, and based on this, I had 3 main chapters. One of them deals with the effect of the war on gender relations, war and women. Mm-hmm. The other one looks at war and political culture. And the third chapter from this section looks at how a civil war can actually result in a secularization process, mm-hmm. results in a religious decline. And in the last section, based on all of this, I have a separate section called War and Peace, looking at the prospects for a peaceful coexistence between the Kurds and the Turks in Turkey, given this long history of protracted civil war.
Okay. So I saw in the book description that it said you did interviews with about, or got information from about 2,100 different people affected by the conflict.
Yes. I mean, this is a work of, I would say, at least 4 years of hard work, traveling to several countries, including Canada, Belgium, Germany, and obviously Turkey, mm-hmm. because most of the interviews were conducted in Turkey. Mm-hmm. Okay. So I worked with a survey company located in Istanbul, mm-hmm. and that was in summer of 2014. And 2014 turned out to be a great year to actually conduct a research like this, because it was the short ceasefire that was largely observed by the Turkish state and the Kurdish insurgent group, the PKK, mm-hmm. that started about a year before that and ended, unfortunately, in the middle of 2015. Mm-hmm. So I talked to this survey company and I told them about my idea of collecting data on these aspects of war. Mm-hmm. They did an excellent job. They ended up contacting nearly 4,000 people in 3 major Kurdish provinces in eastern part of Turkey. Mm-hmm. And these provinces were Diyarbakir, Van, and Urfa. And the reason we picked these provinces, the 2, Diyarbakir and Van provinces, are not only Kurdish majority, but they also have been exposed to violence mm-hmm. at a higher level than the 3rd province of Urfa. So I wanted to get data from these 3 Kurdish but somewhat different provinces in a way to get a sense of whether I am right about my expectations that exposure to violence can result in some positive socio-political changes. Mm-hmm. So after contacting these nearly 4,000 people, 2,100 of them agreed to participate in our study. Mm-hmm. So the response rate is not as high as we want it to be, but given the sensitivity of the research project, because we did ask them some really sensitive questions, mm-hmm. and given that it is a conflict zone, still I think it is a high response rate. I personally interviewed about 100 people. And many of these people were, some of them were educated, some of them were not. Some of them had become refugees in Canada, Belgium, and Germany, and some of them still live in the Kurdish region of Turkey. Some of them were former PKK militants, and some of them were just ordinary citizens. And the reason I wanted to have these in-depth interviews was to get a better understanding of how wartime experiences change you, how do they transform you, and through what mechanisms.
Because I can imagine, just for security reasons, some people might be reluctant to, put their information or names or anything out there, just because it is, I guess, sort of an ongoing conflict. So.
You're absolutely right about that, and that explains why we don't have a very high response rate. One of the things that we did, and in many other studies that I have conducted in Turkey, was that we explained the project to them. We had their consent before we interviewed them. And I would like to emphasize one more thing about this, that none of them is being mentioned by their names in the project. So it is interview number 1, interview number 2, and the private information about these people are never mentioned in the project. And many of them answered this large questionnaire without giving us their names, other than we collected data on their gender and age and their income level, but no other personal information was collected.
So can you elaborate a little bit on the positive aspects that you mentioned that you noticed occur during the conflict?
This, I would like to think, is probably my biggest contribution to the literature, because when you look at the large literature on war and change, most of studies would argue that war is destructive. War is a horrible thing. It is bad for the environment, it is bad for the economy, it dislocates people, which is absolutely true. And this is the case for the Kurdish case as well. But when I was looking at the other side of the picture, which war is a multi-dimensional phenomenon, and my issue with using it just a destructive phenomenon was that the Kurdish case, it started in 1984, and it has been going on for more than 3 decades now. As someone who is very familiar with this case, not just as a scholar, also as a person who has an organic relationship to this case, I have been visiting the same region pretty much every year. And when you compare what you see right now to 20 years ago, there is a radical change. And these radical changes, obviously, over time, societies do change. And the change cannot be explained entirely by the war dynamics. I'm very well aware of that, and I do acknowledge that. Nonetheless, when we look at the empowerment of women in the Kurdish case, 20 years ago, I do remember very clearly, people would be reluctant to send their girls to even elementary school in that part of the country. We are talking about a very conservative Muslim majority society in the middle of the Middle East. And the traditional Muslim culture is quite pessimistic. The traditional Muslim culture is obedient more so than being activist. And the Kurdish people, by and large, are Sunni majority people, like many other peoples in the region. So it's also socioeconomically much less developed blending and going through some gender equality reforms, or becoming more secular, or becoming more politically active. These outcomes are much more surprising in the context of the Kurdish. So 20 years ago, women would have to fight to actually get elementary school education because their parents would not be eager to actually send their girls to school. Now, when you go to the Kurdish region, nearly half of the mayors in the Kurdish region, elected by the Kurdish people on the ticket of the pro-Kurdish political party, they are females. So they have emerged as mayors, as members of parliament, as politically active and very powerful group within the society. This is one of the main positive outcomes that I would like to emphasize that comes out of this project.
So while you can note that you see these changes and you can, connect them to the conflict, are you able to, from the information you gathered, are you able to go deeper to explain more precisely why such changes would be occurring?
That's actually a great question, because when you look at the mechanisms through which these changes occur, the primary mechanisms that many other wonderful studies have pointed out is what is called the social psychological link. And one of the reasons why people do change their values and their norms as they go through an armed conflict, because they learn how to empathize with the victims and with others. In addition to this psychological linkage, I also look at educational aspect of war, and the primary mechanism I would like to add to this is ideological aspects of war. And I think in addition to these psychological factors, which was also a part of the explanation in my work, there is a strong influence of the insurgent group's ideology, which is rooted in a Marxist-Leninist ideology in terms of portraying gender relations, and leftist approach to gender relations and religion is obviously much more progressive than, let's say, an Islamist approach to gender relations and religion. So the PKK's ideology is also a significant factor to explain these changes. And I think the primary example, to just put everything into a context, would be violence is not enough to produce positive changes. When you look at the Syrian situation, for instance, on the one hand we have Islamic State waging an insurgency using violence. On the other hand, we have the Kurdish militia PYD in northern Syria. They both are violent groups, but they do have diametrically opposed and different ideologies. So one of them depicts women to be a second-class citizen. The other is trying to introduce significant and radical reforms when it comes to gender equality. And that is the case in the Kurdish case in Turkey. The PKK's ideology, the PKK's approach to gender relations and religion, in my opinion, is one of the primary factors that has brought about these positive changes.
So, with the existence of these positive changes, would you say they would tend to reduce the likelihood of the conflict continuing, or would they increase, or would they have any effect on whether the conflict continues or not?
No, the conflict in Turkey, unfortunately, is still continuing. The ceasefire, agreed upon ceasefire, came to an end in 2015. women do make up about 1/3 of the PKK militia. When you look at the pro-Kurdish political party, which is also represented in the Turkish parliament, and oftentimes it is being portrayed by the Turkish state, or I should say accused by the Turkish state of being a front for the PKK. They also have about 30 to 40% of their members are female. So women's participation in the conflict, I think it is putting a lot of pressure on both sides to change their approach to the conflict. What it has enabled the insurgent group to continue its fight against one of the most powerful armies in the Middle East. Women have fundamentally changed the very fabric of the Kurdish conflict and the society. So even if there is a peace agreement, let's say next year or hopefully sooner, I think women's participation in the conflict, unlike many other situations where women were used as an instrument during the war, and once the war came to an end, they were forgotten. In this situation, the chances are they will not be forgotten because women had their own institutions within the Kurdish movement at this time. The leadership and the party's commitment to gender equality, it is quite deep and ideological. It is not a tactical approach to women. So it's certainly making it more likely to make the peace, and more importantly, I think if the parties agree on a peace agreement, that peace agreement is more likely to be much more comprehensive and much more sustainable if and when it happens.
So you sort of answered my next question already a bit, but I'll ask it. So in this conflict and others, when they last as long as this has been going on, over 30 years, does it become, do people start to become tired of it, or does it establish itself as a normal way of life, and so perhaps becomes less likely to end at this point?
No, this is a very good, also a very difficult question, because violence does have some unintended consequences. So I think it primarily depends on how the insurgent group interprets the violence. The framework they are able to offer to people who are suffering because of the violence. Now, grievances, political, economic, and social grievances can be manipulated, they can be manufactured, so that the pain and suffering. One of the things that the Kurdish insurgent group has succeeded in doing is, I think, they have been able to frame it in such a way that the people that are suffering because of it are not necessarily blaming the Kurdish insurgent group for their suffering. So, and that is another insight that I think comes out of my research. The effect of violence on the outcomes that I am discussing in the book, such as gender relations, religion, and democracy, it's actually very, very contextual, and it needs to be qualified. So people who were exposed to violence, people who were tortured, people who suffered directly because of the violence, for instance, their approach to women's rights, their approach to religion, and their approach to political activism and democracy, it was fundamentally different than the approach of those who were exposed to violence, but not directly, rather indirectly. So I think when you're going back to your question, can violence actually create a different chaotic situation where it turns or it becomes a part of normal life of the society? Obviously there is a danger there, but in many other situations you see the collapse of border Somalia Syria, Yemen, and Libya actually would be great examples for this. But in the Kurdish situation, the Kurdish insurgent group has been extremely careful about using violence for a reason. Violence is not necessarily the end goal. And they are very careful about organizing people and trying to actually build something rather than just fight for something that is not achievable. So they're very realistic about what they are fighting for, and they also are aiming for post-conflict institution building and post-conflict society. As they are fighting, they also are helping to create women's groups and different non-governmental organizations, civil society groups at the individual, at the societal level. In a way, they are preparing the ground for building something once the conflict ends. I don't think they are actually aiming at fighting forever. So you do have a point there. I mean, there is risk there because violence does change the society in so many different ways. But the organization and the discipline they have, I assume they will be able to manage that difficult transformation and transition.
So let me turn to the resources you used for your research. You mentioned the survey and the interviews. Can you expand on what else you used to do your research for this book?
I also, in addition to this original data, because it was collected by us, so this is the first time that will be published. This makes up the basis of the result that I present in the book. But in addition to that, I also ended up using many books and journal articles that are examining other similar situations. As I got into trying to understand the relationship between violence and trauma, I also ended up getting into this literature written by medical researchers. So what is trauma? How do you deal with trauma? So it wasn't, I used a number of different literatures and secondary resources, but some of them were not necessarily political science or science works. So the medical researchers, for instance, they have some wonderful insights on the effect of war-related trauma on individuals. We become a traumatized person, and one of the issues I had with it was the trauma and victim as concepts. I think they need to be qualified in the context of civil war. You are not a victim unless you consider and you accept defeat. If you keep fighting, you are not a victim, you are a fighter. Even if you are suffering because of your fight, still, I think describing someone like that as a victim and describing his or her experiences as trauma may not necessarily be the right way to do that. They are making sense of what they are doing. They're assigning some meaning to it. And that, I think, should help us to move beyond these the popular terms used to explain the suffering and pain. They are not entitled victims, and they are not necessarily traumatized. They are suffering because of it. The pain and suffering is there, but they are not victims. They keep fighting. They have not defeated yet in their minds, at least.
Well, that's a very fascinating point, actually. So despite the sort of the negative nature of the subject matter, what part of the research did you find most enjoyable?
talking about something like this, it was a very difficult project for me in that I also ended up asking the very same questions to myself as a person, not just as a political scientist.
Mm-hmm.
So the part of conducting this research, I think, when I met with maybe 100 people to listen to their painful stories, really personal, intimate stories.
Mm-hmm.
At some situations, I felt like at that point I was only a human being.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't a political scientist. I wasn't a professor. I wasn't a Kurd. Or all these social and political identities that I had. I think at that moment, now I remember that I actually forgot about all of them. I was just listening to them as a human being, and it's both enlightening, transformative, but also it was, I think I should say, it was really touching and painful at the same time,
Mm-hmm.
because I ended up listening to some extremely painful stories. One of the interviews that I conducted with a 60-year-old man, he had lost 3 sons. And when I visited his home, I think there were 6 or 7 pictures hanging on his wall. The 3 of them were from his own family, and the rest were his cousins.
Mm-hmm.
And a very strong man, still functioning as a normal individual, doing his business, taking care of his family. And he hasn't given up. He's not traumatized. I wouldn't describe it just another trauma.
Mm-hmm.
As I stated earlier, I don't think he considers himself to be a victim. And the same person was arrested in the 1990s, who was also tortured for hours. And the same person was also forced to leave his village in the 1990s. He was displaced because of the conflict.
Mm-hmm.
When I was interviewing him, at the end of the interview, he cried a little bit, so he ended up crying.
Mm-hmm.
That was one of the, in a way, most transformative and also most touching and painful moments for me.
Mm-hmm.
That similar situations happened with other people too, but collecting large hand data from 2,100 individuals was not exactly personal, because it was collected by the survey company I mentioned earlier, but I also did these interviews, and I think on a positive note, as I was working on this project, ended up visiting Canada, Toronto and Montreal twice.
Mm-hmm.
I ended up visiting Kurdish community in Belgium and in Germany also. So it was, and I ended up interviewing some former combatants, former militants who later became refugees in different countries. I would rather not say their exact location.
Mm-hmm.
and say different countries. One of them I interviewed for 10 days. So I actually got the whole story from him, what made him join the insurgency, about his time with the insurgency, when he was arrested and was jailed for 10 years. He spent 10 years in prison. Then he managed to leave the country and became a political refugee in Europe. The other one that I interviewed was a woman, former combatant, joined the insurgency in her late teens, quite young, and this person lost one of her legs when uncertainty. And I interviewed the second former combatant for 3 days. I was really, I was touched by their stories, but also I was impressed by the strength they had.
Mm-hmm.
So the way they described their situation, and I actually, after like hours of interviewing them, I couldn't help myself to act like a social scientist.
Mm-hmm.
And I even asked them, so do you regret doing all of this? Do you feel like that was a bad experience? Like, they would pause for a second, think about it, but the main answer pretty much every one of these people gave me was like, no, I would have done it anyway. Even if I had to do it now, I would do it. So
mm-hmm.
they were not, they didn't have this defeatist mentality. They don't think they are defeated and traumatized and they have turned into victims. So that the strength that I observed was also was very influential for me as a person, as a political.
So from an academic point of view, what did you find that was most surprising in your research?
Now, the most surprising finding was that when you look at these ordinary Kurds, obviously many of them have been treated, and more than half of the respondents in our sample, they said that they were exposed to violence in one form or another. In the relationship between exposure to violence and changing attitudes toward the women, one of the most striking findings was, for instance, we asked them a question that men are better political leaders than women. To what extent do you agree or disagree with this statement?
Mm-hmm.
Another question that we asked them was, if a woman makes more money than her husband, it is certain that it will cause some problems. To what extent do you agree or disagree with these statements? And we also had data on the exposure to violence. And our exposure to violence index is based on 6 questions. So, have you ever been arrested because of the conflict? Have you ever been tortured? Have you ever been displaced directly or indirectly? That's why we have these 6 different questions. When I analyzed that, people who are exposed to violence do have some, I should say, observable differences, noticeable differences than those who either were not exposed to violence, but they were exposed at a lesser degree.
Hmm.
So people who are exposed are much more likely to agree to gender equal society, that women should be a part of our society, and they do deserve what a man deserves. That was one of the statistical findings that I found. But I think another finding, which we haven't gotten a chance to discuss yet, was the Kurdish society, as I mentioned earlier, is primarily a Muslim majority society. Socially and politically, you would expect to be quite religious and conservative. And it is actually the case. So about half of the respondents that participated in our survey, for instance, they told us that they were actually praying on a daily basis as a Muslim, practicing Muslim.
Mm-hmm.
Another, something that we need to contextualize is also the Kurdish people and the Turkish people are both Sunni Muslim majority societies.
Mm-hmm.
So when you look at the conflict between, for instance, Palestinians and Israel, the conflict between Chechnya and Russia, for Kashmir and India, in these cases, the groups belong to different religions.
Mm-hmm.
So the conflict actually helped the minority to embrace their religious identity as a result of the conflict. So Palestinians are becoming more Muslim and more religious, and the role of religion in the Chechen and the Kashmiri identity is becoming stronger as a result of their conflict with a group that comes from a different state. That is not the case in the Kurdistan, because both the Kurds and the Turks are Sunni Muslim majority societies.
Mm-hmm.
And when you look at the effect of conflict on religion here, and the Kurdish people are fighting for equality, justice, or at least an equal and a better relationship with the Turkish state dominated by Sunni Muslim Turks.
Mm-hmm.
They have begun to question the value of religion, the value of Islam in their identity. That was one of the, in my opinion, the most striking findings. They are becoming less and less religious, more and more secular over time. Now, when I say secular, I would like to explain it a little bit. Here I do not mean they are moving away from Islam altogether.
Mm-hmm.
They are becoming more secular in that Islam is becoming just one aspect of their identity. They are no longer describing themselves as Muslims and Muslims alone.
Mm-hmm.
One of the first things they will tell you is, when I ask them about their national identity, how do they feel, whether they are Kurdish first, then Muslim, or Muslim first, then Kurdish, most would say, I'm Kurdish first, then Muslim.
Mm-hmm.
And some would even actually say, I'm not a Muslim at all anymore, because after what my Muslim brothers have done to me, I don't feel it that way, they say. So that was another interesting finding in our in the research. Muslim Kurds, as a result of this ongoing conflict with the Muslim Turks, are becoming more and more secular, moving away from their Islamic identity. And especially when Turkey as a country is becoming more and more Islamic under the rule of the AKP, this outcome is becoming more and more observable. They do not necessarily deny their Islamic identity, but they have, I think, managed to put Islam into their identity as a part of their identity. That was, in my opinion, one of the most interesting findings, and you wouldn't find this, for instance, in many other conflicts, such as some of the conflicts I mentioned earlier, because the context is very different.
Mm-hmm.
So when you look at the war in El Salvador, the civil war in Guatemala, you don't have an ethnic dimension to those conflicts. So in the Kurdish case, you have two ethnic groups that are fighting with one another, and both of them have the same faith. Both of them are primarily Sunni Muslims.
Mm-hmm.
And the insurgent group, the PKK, has done a very good job in terms of portraying Islam as a source of the problem. I think that should be emphasized again. So the insurgent group's contribution is notable. They are not entirely and publicly denying the place of Islam in Kurdish identity. After it is a Muslim majority society. But they have been very successful in relegating Islam to a secondary place. Mm-hmm. And that is, I think, a significant secularization taking place among the Kurdish society.
From an academic point of view, what was there a question that was the most difficult for you to research and maybe come to a conclusion on, or maybe you still feel like you don't have a good idea of what you feel the conclusion is?
I think here I would like to point out some potential weaknesses of the design that I'm using in this project, and that is a survey data.
Mm-hmm.
So, like many other surveys, the data you get from surveys needs to be used cautiously, because we can never be certain of whether people are telling us the truth or telling us their true opinion. That's a problem. Some of the questions that we asked were extremely sensitive questions. So, for instance, when we asked, well, have you ever been tortured? Have you ever been arrested? Some people were not exactly comfortable with answering our questions because these were really sensitive questions.
Mm-hmm.
So from the academic point of view, we need to keep this in mind when we interpret the findings from the survey data. However, that's why I think we need to have a theory first. We need to have a story to tell first.
Mm-hmm.
We need to be able to explain the mechanisms through which these positive changes might occur before we actually present the statistical findings. And that was, obviously I am very well aware of this weakness of survey design.
Mm-hmm.
That's a weakness. And that was one of the reasons why I wanted to have this in-depth, hours-long interviews with people to get a sense of, okay, what is going on with these people. When you talk to someone for 3 hours, sometimes 4 days in some situations, I think it's much easier to get a sense of how to relate exposure to violence to the positive outcomes that I am describing in the book.
Mm-hmm.
Another weakness of the study, now that you are asking it, I think in addition to the survey design, it was just one survey conducted in 2014. So it's not looking at the changes over time.
Mm-hmm.
So whether it is a result of this long, protracted civil war, or was it because of the certain time frame in which the survey was conducted? From the data available to us, from the data at hand, we cannot conclusively answer this question. So these are some of the problems and some of the issues I think we need to keep in mind when we read this project.
Mm-hmm. What do you hope the book will do?
That's a tough question. I mean, my biggest hope that it will teach people that we all are humans more than anything else, more than being a Muslim, a Christian, a Turk, a Kurd, or a secular person or a religious person.
Mm-hmm.
Despite all of these positive outcomes that I'm describing, there is a dark side to it. Every single time I visit the region, I was there just a couple of months ago this past summer. The war has been really difficult for many people. So people are going through some really difficult times. I hope that the book will help the readers to see it from the other side of the equilibrium. So to teach them how to empathize. That we should be able to look at it from other people's point of view.
Mm-hmm.
And after that, peace is much more difficult to build. Peace is much more beautiful and much more valuable than the war. So I truly hope that this book will at least make a difference, at least contribute just a little bit to this reaching an understanding that we all can live together as human beings, and a dignified peace that is still possible. That's my hope.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned some of the limitations with the data you collected. Can you speak to any other difficulties you might have had in finishing the book or getting it published, and how you overcame those?
Not in that sense. I mean, other than working on it for about 4 years. It was a long time. Those 4 years, obviously, also I learned so much from working on a project like this. I also enjoyed doing it. I think it was transformative for me as now. But once I had a good proposal and I sent it out to a number of publishers, the University of Michigan Press, they were really quick. When I sent them like a brief proposal, they were, in a way, they jumped on it, and I was really happy with working with them, because they were very good at getting back to me and sending out for review. They have been very helpful, and I would like to thank them, every one of them who is involved in production of this book. No, I mean, the publication of the book wasn't really that difficult for me, but it took me, as I mentioned earlier, about 3 or 4 years to collect the data, to refine the data, to write the theory, and to explain all of these complicated and difficult questions and outcomes. But in terms of publishing it, other than the time that I had to go through it, for us, it really takes years to publish something like this. Other than that, no, I mean, it was a smooth process, I should say.
What's your next writing project?
I have been thinking about writing a book that's not heavy on statistical analysis. And the reason I want to do that is I would like to be able, hopefully I will do that soon, I would like to be able to write something that an ordinary person without the social science training can actually read and enjoy and give it some feedback. So my next project, I think, will be an extension of this, without statistical analysis, without empirical finding, and without the social science terminology that not many people, not everyone is familiar with. So it would be telling the story of perhaps a group of people. So from a personal point of view, what does it mean to be a woman in the Kurdish movement? What does it mean to be a Kurd in Turkey? And I actually have been trying to collect some data on that. I have a couple of ideas that some of the chapters in the book, like the chapter on war and women and the chapter on war and religion, these 2 chapters I think can be turned into a book-length project in the future. But as I said earlier, I would like to be able to tell a story with which I can connect to ordinary people without a social science training or a PhD in political science.
Where can people find the book, and where can people follow you online if you have any sort of online presence?
I think nowadays finding any book, including this one, is fairly easy. Just Googling the title of the book or Googling my name, they should be able to get a copy of the book. It's available on University of Michigan Press's website, and it is e-copy. The electronic copy actually came out just today, and the print copy will be out in 2 weeks, by October 15th. Other than that, I don't have a personal website, but just Googling my name, go to Google Scholar or just Google it, I think they should be able to have access to the previous research articles I have published on similar topics.
That's all the questions I have. Do you have any final words or thoughts?
I really would like to thank you for reaching out to me and giving me the opportunity to explain this project. So thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to hearing from others, their feedbacks, their reviews about this project. I really would like this project be just a first project in producing more similar works, and I really would like this project to contribute to the peace more than anything. So again, thank you very much.
Thank you. This podcast has been presented by War Scholar. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to visit warscholar.org or militaryhistorypodcast.com for more great interviews and military history information. Your visits help support this podcast. One of the best ways to provide feedback for this podcast is to rate me on iTunes. Please give me a good rating if you liked it, or feel free to give me a bad rating if you didn't. I'll use that feedback to make this a better podcast. You can also follow me on Instagram under Cris Alvarez War Scholar. That's Cris without an H, C-R-I-S. On Facebook under War Scholar, on YouTube under War Scholar 1945, and on Twitter under War Scholar. Thank you, and I hope you return to this podcast for more great military history.